The airport was never quiet. Not really. Even at 6:47 in the morning, Murtala Muhammed International hummed with a particular kind of chaos, trolleys colliding, announcements layering over each other in Yoruba and English and French, the smell of fried plantain drifting from somewhere it had no business drifting from at this hour. Solène Abara had worked in flight logistics for 4 years. She knew this airport the way you know a difficult relative, its rhythms, its shortcuts, its capacity to destroy your day at any moment without warning. Today it was trying its best. Toby, please. Her son had decided, with the full conviction of a 4-year-old, that the moving walkway was a toy. He stood at the edge of it, arms out, giggling as it carried him backwards while she pulled him forward by his jacket hood. Her carry-on caught on the wheel of a stranger's trolley. Her company ID swung loose from her lanyard and slapped her in the chin. "Ma, your bag," the stranger started. "I see it, thank you." She freed the wheel, repositioned Tobias on her hip, reset the carry-on strap on her shoulder, and kept moving. Gate 14. She needed Gate 14. The audit documents were already in Seoul waiting for her, 3 years of her company's Korean partnership under review, and her supervisor had decided, with 48 hours notice, that she was the one to fly out and sit across a boardroom table for a week. Single mother, she'd wanted to say. "I don't just pack." But she'd packed. Found a nanny approved through the company's Seoul office, a warm woman named Mrs. O who'd sent her a selfie holding a bowl of rice to prove she existed. Reorganized Tobias's entire schedule. Booked his seat beside hers. Operated on 4 hours of sleep and airport coffee that tasted like a threat. Gate 14 appeared ahead of her and she exhaled. The seating area was full, the usual pre-boarding crowd of business people on laptops and families negotiating snacks. Solène steered toward the far end, settled Tobias onto a seat with his cartoon backpack and a tablet she'd loaded with enough content to survive a transoceanic flight. She crouched in front of him. "What are the rules?" He held up small fingers. "No kicking the seat. Headphones stay on. Don't bother the people next to us." A pause. "Unless it's an emergency." "And what counts as an emergency?" "If I need to wee." "Good boy." She kissed his forehead and straightened up, rolling her neck. The boarding desk was still closed, 15 minutes, maybe 20. She reached into her bag for her documents folder and turned toward the desk to check the screen. That was when she stopped. He was standing at the far end of the boarding desk. For a moment she thought she was wrong, that 4 hours of sleep and stress had bent her perception into something it wasn't. But her body knew before her mind finished the argument. Her stomach dropped in one clean, nauseating motion. Shin Jae-il. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was the suit, charcoal, perfectly cut, the kind that didn't come off a rack. His jaw was sharper. His hair was shorter on the sides, pushed back on top, a few threads of early silver at the temple that hadn't been there 5 years ago. 2 men stood slightly behind him on each side, not family, not colleagues. The way they held their hands and tracked the room said something else entirely. He was looking at his phone. She should have moved. Looked away. Found something, anything, to occupy her face and her posture before he glanced up. For seconds, maybe 5, where she could have reset the entire situation. She didn't move. He looked up. The phone stayed in his hand. His eyes found her the way you find something you've looked for so long you stopped expecting to, with a stillness that was almost worse than a reaction. He didn't startle. Didn't blink excessively. He just looked at her, and she felt it like pressure against her sternum. Tobias chose this exact moment to say loudly, "Mummy, who is that man?" Solene's blood turned to ice water. She reached down automatically and touched her son's shoulder, a small, steadying gesture that was really for herself. Across the gate, she watched Jael's eyes move. Down. To Tobias. She saw him register the boy's face, the age of him, the way he sat with his legs swinging and his cartoon backpack shaped like a turtle. She watched Jael do the thing she'd spent 4 years dreading someone doing. He's looking at him the way you look at a question you almost know the answer to. The gate speaker crackled. "Mr. Shin Jae-il, your priority boarding is now available at Gate 14. Mr. Shin, Gate 14. He looked back at her. She didn't breathe. He moved. Unhurried, completely composed, the 2 men falling into step behind him as he crossed the gate toward the desk. The path took him past her. He knew this. She knew he knew this. There were 3 other routes to the desk and he chose the one that brought him within arm's reach of where she stood. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. But as he passed her, his shoulder met hers, slow, deliberate, half a second of contact that could not have been accidental in a space this wide. A message delivered without words. She felt it travel all the way down her arm. Then he was at the desk, the attendant smiling and lifting the rope, and he walked through without looking back. Solène stood very still. "Mummy." Tobias tugged her sleeve. "You're squeezing me." She looked down. Her hand had tightened on his shoulder. She released it. "Sorry, baby." Her voice came out even. Remarkable, given the state of her chest. "Put your headphones on for me." He obeyed cheerfully, already reaching for the tablet. She turned away from the boarding desk and sat down beside him, folder open in her lap, and stared at the page without reading a single word. "Think," she told herself. "He doesn't know. He can't know just from looking. Children look like all kinds of things." But she'd seen his face in that half-second. The arithmetic happening behind his eyes. She knew what he looked like when he was solving something, that particular quality of stillness, the way he went very quiet on the outside when something was moving very fast on the inside. She pressed her fingers to her collarbone and caught herself doing it. "Stop." She put her hand in her lap. 13 hours. So. A boardroom. Professional distance. She could manage that. She had managed 5 years of this, 4 of them with a small boy who had his father's brow line and his father's habit of going very still when thinking, and she had managed. She would manage this. The gate opened for general boarding. Solène packed up her folder, lifted Tobias onto her hip, and walked toward the desk with her boarding pass ready. She did not look back at the private jetway. She didn't need to. She already knew, with the certainty of someone who understood how the past worked, that Shin Jae-il was not going to let her disappear again. Seoul remembered her. That was the only way Solène could describe it, the feeling that hit her as the cab pulled out of Incheon Airport and the city began assembling itself outside the window. The Han River catching morning light. The green hills pressing against the skyline like they were holding it in place. Convenience stores glowing on every corner. The particular shade of gray that Seoul's sky wore in autumn, not sad exactly, just serious. She'd been 22 the first time she arrived here. A semester exchange, a university adventure, a chapter she'd told herself she was ready for. She hadn't been ready. Nobody was ever ready for Seoul. It demanded too much of your attention, fed you too well, introduced you to people who rearranged you. It had introduced her to him. "Stop. Mummy, are the buildings taller here or in Lagos?" Tobias had his nose pressed to the glass. He'd slept for 9 of the 13 hours like it was nothing. 4-year-olds had no respect for time zones, and had woken up somewhere over the Yellow Sea ready to engage with the world. "Taller here," she said. "Why?" "Less land. More people. They had to build up instead of out." He considered this with the gravity of someone filing it away for future use, then went back to fogging the window with his breath. The company hotel was in Mapogu, clean, functional, a step above modest. Mrs. O was already waiting in the lobby, exactly as warm as her rice bowl selfie had promised. She had Tobias laughing within 4 minutes and promising to teach her a Lagos handshake within 6. Solène handed over the nanny schedule, the emergency contacts, the snack preferences, the specific instruction that Tobias could not have any screen time after 7 p.m. or he became philosophically opposed to sleeping. Mrs. O listened to all of this with the patience of a woman who had raised children and then other people's children and was not remotely intimidated. Solène went upstairs, showered, changed into her audit clothes, and told herself she felt prepared. The first meeting was at 9. The sole office of her company's Korean partner occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower in Uedo, the kind of building that was all angles and ambition, the kind of lobby that made you stand straighter automatically. She rode the elevator with 2 colleagues who'd flown in from the Abuja branch, going over numbers on a shared tablet. The boardroom was already half full when they entered. Long glass table. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. On the far wall, frosted lettering, Shin Global Logistics. Solène saw the name and stopped walking. Her Abuja colleague bumped into her from behind. "Sorry, you all right?" "Fine," she said. "Thought I forgot something." She hadn't forgotten anything. She had simply failed, in the 48 hours of emergency preparation and logistical chaos, to connect the name of the Korean partner company to the surname of the men she'd seen at the airport. Shin was not an uncommon name. She hadn't thought. The door at the far end of the boardroom opened. Shin Jae-il walked in. He was in navy today, a different suit but the same architecture of authority. He moved to the head of the table without looking at the room first, setting down a single folder, exchanging a quiet word with the men beside him. Then he looked up. His eyes found her immediately. As though he'd already known exactly where she was standing. She kept her face neutral through an act of will she would not fully appreciate until later. The meeting ran for 3 hours. In those 3 hours, Shin Jae-il spoke to her exactly once, through his assistant, a precise young man named Kwon, who leaned over mid-session to inform her that Mr. Shin would like the Lagos fulfillment data cross-referenced with Q2 projections before tomorrow's session. She'd nodded and written it down and not looked at the head of the table. Professional. Glacial. Entirely survivable. It was the elevator that undid the arrangement. She was waiting alone, her colleagues had gone ahead, she'd stayed to gather her materials, when she heard his footsteps. She recognized them before she saw him. That particular unhurried cadence. He stopped beside her. They stood in silence looking at the elevator doors. "You planned this," she said quietly. Not an accusation. Just a fact she was putting on the table. "The partnership has existed for 2 years, he said. You were assigned to the audit, not me. You knew I worked for Delta's Freight." A pause. "I knew." The elevator opened. They stepped in together. The doors closed and the small space contracted around them in the way elevator spaces do when the people inside have history. He pressed 14. She pressed lobby. "You have a son," he said. The same words as her imagined version of this conversation, every time she'd rehearsed it in the dark. She'd always planned a better response. "Yes," she said. "How old?" She looked at the floor numbers descending. 4. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened and she walked out and he did not follow. She crossed the marble floor and pushed through the glass doors into the cool afternoon air and stood on the pavement for a moment with her eyes closed. 4, she'd said. She hadn't said 4 in 3 months. She hadn't said born in March. She'd given him the minimum and hoped the minimum wasn't enough. She already knew it was. The envelope arrived at 7:14 that evening. A hotel staff member knocked and handed it over with the practiced neutrality of someone paid not to have opinions. Inside, a single card, heavy stock, no letterhead. Dinner. 9 p.m. Penthouse, Hannam Tower South. J. No number to call. No alternative offered. The confidence of someone who had never needed to follow up a message in his life. Solène sat on the edge of the bed and held the card for a long time. In the next room, she could hear Mrs. O reading to Tobias in a mix of Korean and English, her voice doing different character voices, Tobias correcting her pronunciation of Lagos with enormous authority. She should not go. Every sensible part of her, the part that had built a careful, stable life, the part that had made peace with the choice she'd made at 22 and carried it without apology, said very clearly, "Do not go to that penthouse." She put the card on the nightstand. She went to go and get dressed. The penthouse was on the 31st floor. The elevator opened directly into it, no corridor, no buffer, just doors parting and the space revealing itself all at once. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, Seoul glittering below like something spilled and never cleaned up. The furniture was dark wood and clean lines, expensive in the way that didn't need to announce itself. No clutter. No photographs on the walls. Nothing personal except a single shelf of books near the window that she noticed immediately because she'd always noticed his books. She stepped out. The elevator closed behind her. "You're on time." He came from the kitchen, no jacket, shirt sleeves folded to the forearm, a dish towel over his shoulder. It was so disarmingly domestic that for a moment she lost the careful posture she'd constructed in the cab ride over. "You cook," she said. "I always cooked." "I know. She stopped. "I forgot." She hadn't forgotten. She remembered everything. That was the problem. "It smells good." "Doenjang jjigae." "Sit." She sat at the dining table, set for 2, understated, a single candle she suspected was not for romance but simply because he preferred low light. He moved back into the kitchen without ceremony and she exhaled slowly, looking out at the city. She'd been in rooms with powerful men before. Work had put her across the table from directors and ministers and men who used silence as a management strategy. This was different. The power in this room wasn't performed. It simply existed, the way pressure existed at depth, you felt it without seeing its source. He set the food down. Sat across from her. Poured water. For a while they ate and talked around everything that mattered. She asked about the Shin global expansion into West Africa, genuinely curious, professionally grounded. He answered fully, asked about bottlenecks she'd observed in the Lagos operation, and she told him, and for 20 minutes it was almost normal. Two people who knew each other's minds, falling back into the ease of that. Almost. Do you like Lagos? She asked eventually. I've never been. You run a freight operation there. I run 43 operations. I haven't been to most of them. He set his spoon down. I was going to visit. 2 years ago. Something came up. The way he said it landed with a weight she was meant to feel. She kept her face still. That's a long way to go for a site visit. It wasn't for the site visit. Silence. She looked at the candle flame. Jail. Why did you leave? There it was. Not aggressive. Not wounded. Simply direct, the way he'd always been direct, the quality in him that had first disarmed her at 22 because she'd grown up around people who wrapped the real question in 6 others first. She'd prepared an answer. She delivered it. Long distance felt impossible. She'd been young and uncertain. The relationship had been intense and she hadn't known how to manage that intensity from another continent. He listened to all of it. Then, you're lying. Her hand was at her collarbone. She felt it there before she'd registered moving it, fingers resting lightly at the base of her throat. She dropped it to the table. You used to do that in Hongdae, he said. When you told me you weren't cold. When you said you liked the film. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, something more rueful. When you told me you weren't falling in love with me. The city glittered behind him. That one wasn't a lie, she said quietly. No, he agreed. That one wasn't. The candle moved between them. She thought about what she was carrying, the version of that night 5 years ago that she'd packed down so tight and so deep it had nearly become abstract. Nearly. I heard something, she said. Before I left. At your apartment. He went still. I came to tell you something and the door wasn't fully closed and I didn't understand all of it. My Korean wasn't good enough. But I understood enough. She kept her voice measured. There was a man. He was hurt. And you were, the way you spoke, she stopped. Found the thread again. I'd never heard you use that voice. I didn't know that voice existed. He said nothing for a long moment. And you ran. I was 22, she said. And I was, pregnant. The word sat right there, enormous and unspoken. I was scared. Of me. Of what I didn't know about you. She looked at him. There's a difference. He leaned back in his chair, one arm resting on the table, and looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the elevator, like a question he was close to answering. You should have asked me, he said. Would you have told me the truth? A long pause. No, he said. Not then. At least that was honest. She stood and carried her bowl to the kitchen because she needed to move, needed 2 seconds of her back to him. She rinsed it under the tap and stood at the sink looking at the reflection of the room in the dark window above it. She heard him rise. Heard him cross the floor. He stopped a step behind her, not touching, just present, his reflection appearing in the dark glass beside hers. She could see the scar on his forearm from here. Knew since she knew him. What are you now? She asked the reflection. Complicated, he said. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. She turned around. He hadn't moved back to give her space, she turned and found him close, close enough that she had to tilt her chin. This near, she could see things the boardroom hadn't allowed, the faint tension in his jaw. The way his eyes moved over her face like he was checking inventory of something he'd thought lost. I should go, she said. Probably, he agreed. He didn't move. Neither did she. Two adults with too much history and not enough distance standing in a kitchen 31 floors above a city that remembered everything. He reached up slowly, telegraphed, deliberate, giving her every opportunity to step back, and tucked one lock behind her ear. His fingers didn't linger. A gesture that was almost tender and entirely dangerous. She let out a breath. Jae-il. I know, he said. And stepped back. He walked her to the elevator. Pressed the button. They stood beside each other in the familiar silence of people who have said both too much and not enough. The doors opened. She stepped in and turned to face him. He stood with one hand in his pocket, watching her with that particular stillness. "I'm not the same man you left, Solène," he said. "I know. You should be careful with that." The doors closed. She rode down 31 floors with her back against the elevator wall and her eyes on the ceiling, and she did not touch her collarbone once. She considered that a victory. The week had a rhythm to it. Mornings, the boardroom. Shin Global's 14th floor, documents and data and the careful choreography of two people conducting business across a table with 5 years of wreckage underneath it. He spoke to her through Quan. She responded through her Abuja colleague. They were excruciatingly professional. Afternoons, she worked from the hotel, Tobias napping or playing while she cross-referenced the fulfillment data he'd requested. Mrs. O hummed in the background. The city moved outside the window. Evenings, she thought about him more than she should have. By the third day she'd almost convinced herself she had it managed. The rhythm was working. Distance was working. She was a professional and a mother and a woman who had made a clear-eyed decision 5 years ago, and she was not going to unravel it in a Seoul penthouse because he'd tucked her hair back and looked at her like that. The fourth evening undid everything. She'd left her secondary documents folder at the Shin Global office, realized it at 8 p.m. when she went to prep for the next morning session. She sent Quan a message. He responded within minutes, "Mr. Shin will have it delivered personally. He has a late meeting in your area." She stared at her phone. Personally was doing a lot of work in that sentence. She almost messaged back to say she'd collect it in the morning. She typed it. Deleted it. Told herself that was the right call and she'd simply forgotten to send it. At 9:23 the knock came. She opened the door in her hotel robe, hair loose from its bun, face clean. She'd showered after putting Tobias down and hadn't gotten around to changing yet, and this was nobody's fault, it was simply timing. He stood in the corridor in his shirt sleeves, jacket gone, the folder in one hand. He looked at her. She looked at him. Mrs. O took Tobias for an evening walk, she said, because something needed to be said. He refused to sleep, so she offered the night market. She wasn't sure why she'd told him that. Possibly to establish that the room was empty. Possibly because she was already losing the argument with herself and some honest part of her wanted him to know. He held out the folder. She took it. Their fingers didn't touch. She should have said thank you and stepped back and closed the door, and that would have been the end of it. She didn't step back. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the kitchen, that slow, deliberate inventory. Then he reached out and tucked the same lock behind the same ear, and this time his fingers did linger, just briefly, at her jaw. "Don't," she said. Her voice came out low. Not cold. Not convincing. "Then tell me to leave," he said. The folder was in her hand. The door was open. All she had to do was one of those two things. She did neither. What happened next had the quality of something inevitable, not careless, not swept away, but chosen. Each step a decision. She was clear enough in herself to know that. He came inside and the door closed and the distance between them collapsed by degrees, his hands finding her face first, thumbs at her cheekbones, the way you hold something you're not sure is real. She let out a breath that had been lodged somewhere in her chest since gate 14 and felt him feel it. He kissed her slowly. Relearning, not reclaiming. She pulled back once, not to stop, just to look at him. Up close in low light he looked like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. She recognized it because she'd been carrying the same thing. "I'm not 22 anymore," she said. "I know who you are," he said. That was what broke the last of it. Afterward the room was quiet and the city hummed 30 floors below, and they lay in the particular stillness of two people who have just handed each other something irreversible. She'd cried once, briefly, without warning, somewhere in the middle of it all, that sudden surge that comes not from sadness but from the release of something held too tight for too long. He'd stilled immediately, hands framing her face, eyes asking the question without words. She'd shaken her head. "Don't stop." He'd understood. Now he lay beside her and the lamp was off and the city light came through the gap in the curtains in a thin silver line across the ceiling. She was on her back. He was on his side, propped on one elbow. She felt his hand before she understood what he was doing, his thumb moving slowly along her side, tracing the stretch marks that Tobias had left on her skin. Not asking about them. Not remarking. Just, acknowledging them. The way you trace a map you respect. Something tightened in her throat. You don't have to. I know, he said. He kept going. Unhurried. Matter of fact in a way that was more intimate than reverence would have been. She stared at the ceiling and let him. She thought about telling him. Right then, the low light, the quiet, his thumb against her skin, it felt like the moment the truth was shaped for. Tobias is yours. I knew and I ran and I have spent for years watching him make your expressions with your face and your habits with his hands and I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I was so afraid. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Not like this, something in her said. Not in the dark, in a hotel bed, when he has no room to breathe with it. He deserves better than that. She turned her head and looked at him instead. Your arm, she said. The scar on his forearm, pale and thin, running 4 inches along the inside. When? He glanced at it briefly. 3 years ago. Does it? No. He looked back at her. Not anymore. She nodded. Let it rest there. He settled back against the pillow and she didn't move away and after a while the city continued its quiet noise below them and his breathing evened out. She stayed awake longer. Thinking about a 4-year-old boy with his father's brow line sleeping somewhere in a Seoul night market on an ajama's back, utterly fearless, completely loved, entirely unaware of the shape of the story he'd been born into. Tomorrow, she told herself. She would find the words tomorrow. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow did not go the way she planned. She woke to an empty space beside her. For one disoriented second she thought she'd dreamed it, then she saw the slight indent in the pillow and smelled the faint trace of his cologne on the sheets and knew she hadn't. The clock read 6:02. Pale light was beginning at the curtain edges. She sat up and pulled the sheets around her and listened. The room was quiet. Tobias wasn't back yet. Mrs. O had messaged at 11 p.m. to say he'd fallen asleep at the market stall and she'd taken him to her own nearby apartment rather than disturb Solène. She'd thanked her and not examined too carefully why she'd felt relieved. She showered. Dressed. Made coffee from the small machine on the desk and sat by the window watching Seoul assemble itself in the early gray. She would tell him today. She had decided. Before the morning session, or after, it didn't matter. She would find him and she would say it plainly because he deserved plainness and she was tired of the weight of it, tired of watching Tobias reach for something he didn't know he was missing. She had decided. Jae-il's office beat her to it. Kwon called at 8:15 while she was still in the cab. Miss Abara. His voice carried its usual precision but something underneath it was careful in a way it hadn't been before. Mr. Shin has asked to move this morning's session to the afternoon. He apologizes for the short notice and asks that you remain available from 2 o'clock. Is everything all right? A pause that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. Of course. We'll see you at 2. The line ended. She sat in the cab with the phone in her lap and watched the Han River pass outside the window and felt the particular dread of someone who knows that the thing they were afraid of has already happened without them. He came to the hotel at 10. She heard the knock and opened the door and knew immediately from the way he stood, very still, very straight, hands at his sides, the folder in neither of them, that something had shifted. The man in the corridor was not the one who had traced her skin in the dark 8 hours ago. That man had been unguarded. This one had put everything back. In his right hand was a single sheet of paper. He held it out. She took it. Looked at it. Standard company background document, the kind her own firm compiled on all foreign nationals involved in active contracts. Name, passport details, next of kin. Tobias Abara. DOB, March 14th. Mother, Solène Abara. She'd known this was possible. Standard due diligence on business contacts. She'd known and she'd told herself she had time and she had been wrong. She looked up. Is he mine? Jae-il asked. 4 words. Quiet. Contained. The voice of a man holding something explosive with extraordinary care because he was aware of what would happen if he didn't. The silence lasted 3 seconds. It was its own answer and they both knew it. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. She sat on the edge of the bed because her legs made that decision for her and he stood in the middle of the room and she watched him absorb it, watched the stillness in him become something different, denser, a man recalibrating around a fact that rewrote 5 years of history in one breath. Yes, she said. Because he deserved the word, not just the silence. He turned away from her. stood at the window with his back to her for a long moment. She watched his shoulders rise and fall once, a single controlled breath, and then he turned back. Tell me. Not angry yet. Something beneath anger, something more foundational. Tell me why. She told him. All of it this time. No careful edits, no surface answers. The night she'd come to his apartment to tell him she was pregnant. The door ajar. The voices inside. A man she didn't recognize on the floor with blood on his shirt, and Jae-il crouched beside him speaking in a low, flat register she'd never heard, instructing two other men with the calm of someone for whom this was not exceptional. Not a fight, not a loss of control, something worse. Something practiced. She'd stood in that corridor for 30 seconds. Then she'd walked back down the stairs and gone to her dormitory and booked a flight home for the following morning. I was 22, she said. I was 8 weeks pregnant and I was alone in a country that wasn't mine, and I watched you and I didn't know what I'd walked into, but I knew I couldn't walk into it with a child. Jae-il stood across from her and said nothing. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said. I'm not. I know what I took from you. I've always known. Did you? Not a question. Every single day. He looked at her and the controlled quiet on his face cracked, not into rage, not into tears, but into something rawer than either. Grief, maybe. The specific kind that comes from calculating everything that was missed. 4 years, he said. Yes. He's been alive for 4 years and I didn't. He stopped. Reset. What is he like? The question knocked the breath out of her. She hadn't expected that to be the next question. She'd expected the anger, the full weight of it, justified and deserved. Instead he was standing in her hotel room asking what his son was like, and she felt tears arrive without permission. He's loud, she said. Her voice caught once. She pushed through. He argues about everything but he's never cruel. He picks up languages fast. He counted to 10 in Korean last night with Mrs. O. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. He goes still when he's thinking. Really still. He just stops and thinks, and you can almost watch it happening. She looked at him. He gets that from you. Jae-il looked away. She saw his jaw move. I want to meet him, he said. Still quiet. Still controlled. But underneath it's something irrevocable. I'm not asking for anything else right now. I'm not making demands. I want, he stopped again. Found the words. I want to meet my son. Solène nodded. Okay, she said. Not as a business contact. Not with your colleagues nearby. He looked back at her. As his father. The words sat between them, new and enormous and entirely true. Okay, she said again. He walked to the door. Put his hand on it. Paused. I would have chosen you, he said. Not accusing. Just placing it on the record. If you had come to me that night and told me, I would have chosen you both. He left before she could answer. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after. Outside, Seoul continued without interruption, indifferent and glittering, a city that had always known how to hold other people's grief without breaking its own stride. Tobias arrived back at noon, full of market stories, a small ceramic turtle in his bag that Mrs. O had bought him. Solène held him longer than usual. He tolerated it for approximately 8 seconds before wriggling free to show her the turtle. She laughed. She couldn't help it. She almost cancelled 3 times. The first time was that same evening, lying in the dark listening to Tobias breathe from the next bed, the ceramic turtle on the nightstand between them. She'd picked up her phone and typed, maybe we should wait. Give it more time. Stared at it. Deleted it. The second time was the following morning, watching Tobias eat breakfast, the way he held his spoon wrong and refused to be corrected, the way he talked to his food before eating it, the way he was so entirely and completely himself, and she wanted, briefly and fiercely, to keep him only hers for just a little longer. The third time was in the cab on the way to the park, when Tobias asked where they were going and she said to meet someone, and he asked who and she said a friend, and the word felt so profoundly inadequate that she nearly told the driver to turn around. She didn't. Jae-il was already there when they arrived. He was standing near the park entrance with his hands in the pockets of plain dark trousers, no suit, no men flanking him, nothing that said what he was outside of this hour. He looked, for the first time since gate 14, like someone who could be uncertain. He was watching them approach and she could see from 20 meters away that he was very carefully not staring at Tobias. Trying to let the moment arrive at its own speed. She appreciated that. Tobias, however, had no patience for arriving at speeds. "Is that your friend?" he asked loudly, pulling on her hand. "Yes. He's tall." "He is. Does he speak English?" "He does." Tobias considered this sufficient vetting and accelerated. Solène watched her son close the distance between himself and his father and felt something in her chest that had no clean name, pride and grief and tenderness and terror all occupying the same space at the same time. Tobias stopped directly in front of Jael and looked up at him. Jael looked down. For 2 seconds neither of them spoke. Then Tobias pointed at the swings behind him. "Can you push me? Mummy pushes too soft." Something moved across Jael's face, quick, unguarded, gone almost before she caught it. But she caught it. "I can try," he said. Solène sat on the bench and watched Shin Jae-il push a 4-year-old on a swing set in a public park by the Han River and tried to hold herself together with both hands. Tobias had upgraded his request within 3 minutes, higher, then spinning, then a complicated game involving counting to 3 before each push that Jael adopted without complaint. He didn't perform enthusiasm. Didn't try too hard. He was just present. Paying attention in that particular way of his, taking his son seriously the way Tobias demanded to be taken seriously. When Tobias finally tired of the swings he took Jael by 2 fingers, not the whole hand, 2 fingers, the way he did with people he'd decided to provisionally trust, and pulled him toward the small fountain nearby that had koi fish in it. Jael went. She watched them crouch side by side over the water. Tobias pointing, explaining, entirely in charge of the situation. She pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. "I would have chosen you both." She believed him. That was the hardest part, not doubting it, just sitting with the knowledge of what her fear had cost. What it had cost him. What it had quietly cost Tobias in ways a 4-year-old couldn't yet articulate but would someday. Mrs. O had offered to take Tobias for the afternoon if needed. Solène had said she'd see how it went. At the 1-hour mark, Tobias fell asleep. It happened the way it always did, sudden and total, no negotiation, just a small body deciding it was done. He'd climbed into Jael's lap on the bench by the river, still mid-sentence about the koi, and simply stopped. Jael looked down at him and then up at Solène and she saw him recalibrate around the weight of it, the literal, physical weight of his son asleep against his chest. He didn't move. Didn't shift him off. Just sat there with one careful hand on Tobias's back. They talked in low voices while the boy slept. Not about the past, they'd excavated enough of that. This was different. He told her things she hadn't asked for, offered them like he'd decided she was owed them. The syndicate had existed for 2 generations before him, his father's construction, his inheritance at 24 when his father died. He hadn't chosen it the way you choose a career. It had chosen him the way circumstances choose people. He'd spent the first 2 years surviving it. The next 3 years consolidating it. The 2 years after that quietly, carefully, building exits. "Exits," she said. "The legitimate side is real," he said. "Shin Global isn't a front. I've been moving weight into it deliberately. Pulling back from the operations that," he glanced down at Tobias. "The ones I don't want to be running in 5 years." "How many years until 5 years?" 2. Maybe 3, if I'm careful. He looked at her steadily. "I'm telling you this not to reassure you. I'm telling you because if you're going to make a decision about what this is, what any of this is, you should know the actual shape of it." She looked at the river. "That's more than most people get," she said. "You're not most people." Tobias stirred, resettled, went still again. Jael's hand moved automatically, adjusting. "He talks to his food," she said. Jael looked up. "Before he eats it. He introduces himself to it." She shook her head. "I have no idea where he got that." Jael was quiet for a moment. "I used to apologize to fish before I cleaned them," he said. "My grandmother thought it was strange." Solène stared at him. He met her eyes and there it was, that almost smile, the one that had dismantled her at 22 in a Hongdae jazz bar and apparently still carried its full original power. She looked away first. "Jael." "I know," he said. "I'm not saying no to anything," she said carefully. "I'm saying I need to understand what I'm saying yes to before I say it." "That's fair. And Tobias comes first, he said immediately. No hesitation. Always. Before anything between us, before anything I want, he comes first. You have my word. She believed that too. Tobias woke 20 minutes later demanding to know if the fish were still there. Jae-il carried him back to the fountain and crouched beside him again, steady and unhurried, while the boy pressed his nose to the water's edge. Walking back along the river in the late afternoon, Tobias between them, holding Jae-il's 2 fingers on one side and Solene's full hand on the other, chattering without pause, she felt the shape of something she hadn't let herself imagine in a long time. Not perfect. Not simple. Complicated in ways that would require real courage to navigate. But possible. For the first time in 5 years, genuinely possible. She didn't say any of this. But when Jae-il looked across Tobias's head and found her already looking back, neither of them looked away. She almost missed it. That was what stayed with her afterward, how ordinary the day had been right up until it wasn't. Morning session at Shin Global, productive and almost comfortable, the professional distance between them softening into something more like 2 people who had reached an understanding. Lunch with her Abuja colleagues at a jiggy place around the corner. An afternoon of documentation, Tobias drawing elaborate pictures of koi fish at the desk beside her while Mrs. O napped in the chair. Her last full day in Seoul. Flight home tomorrow at noon. At 6 p.m. she kissed Tobias goodbye. Mrs. O was taking him to a children's cultural center nearby, a final Seoul adventure, and headed out to collect the last of the signed audit documents from Shin Global's administrative office. A 30-minute errand. She'd be back before his bedtime. The administrative office was in a separate building 2 streets from the main tower. She collected the documents, signed the receipt, exchanged pleasantries with the desk clerk. Stepped outside into the cool evening. The car was waiting at the curb. Black, unmarked, the kind of vehicle that looked like 100 other vehicles in this part of the city. The driver's window came down. Miss Abara? Mr. Kwan arranged pickup. Traffic is bad, he didn't want you walking. Kwan had arranged pickup for her twice this week. It wasn't unusual. She was tired and her bag was heavy and it was 2 streets. She got in. The door locked. She knew within 90 seconds. The route was wrong, a left where there should have been a right, then an immediate right that took them away from the hotel district entirely. She kept her face forward and her breathing even and her hand moved to her phone in her bag with the casualness of someone adjusting their grip. She didn't open any app. Didn't dial. Typed only into the messaging thread she'd saved under his name on the second day, the one she'd told herself was for professional emergencies. 21. Sent. Then she put the phone back in her bag and looked out the window and memorized everything, street names where she could read them, the direction of the river when it appeared briefly between buildings, the color of the traffic lights, the sound of the area changing as they drove. Industrial. Quieter. The smell of the Han closer than it should be from this direction. The driver didn't speak. Neither did she. She was afraid. She was clear about that with herself, naming it helped. Afraid and therefore very calm, because panic was a luxury and she was a mother who was going home tomorrow and that was simply not negotiable. The warehouse was near the water. Not dramatic, no blindfold, no rough handling. The driver opened her door and gestured, and 2 men she'd never seen stood at a side entrance waiting. She went inside because the alternative presented itself in her peripheral vision in the form of a third man she hadn't noticed until now, and the weight at his hip that she recognized by shape. Inside, concrete, empty shelving, a single room at the back with a chair and a small window near the ceiling that showed dark sky and the edge of a crane. They left her there. Door closed but not locked, she checked after the footsteps faded. A message. We can open this whenever we want was different from you cannot open it. She sat in the chair and thought. You hack. She didn't know the name yet but she would, it would come later, in pieces, from Jae-il's controlled explanation in a car going much faster than the speed limit. What she understood now was simpler, someone within Jae-il's orbit felt threatened by her existence. By Tobias's existence. By the possibility of an heir who hadn't been factored into the succession of whatever structure Jae-il sat at the top of. She was leverage. Or a warning. Or both. Which meant Jae-il was the solution. Which meant 21 had better have landed. It had landed. She heard it before she saw anything, a shift in the warehouse's ambient noise, the kind of change that registers in the body before the ears process it. Voices, then silence, then something that was not quite a confrontation but had all the architecture of one. Then, nothing for 4 minutes. Then the door opened. Jae-il came through it alone. He crossed the room in 8 steps and crouched in front of her chair, hands on her knees, eyes moving over her face, her arms, checking. Systematic. The boardroom men and the penthouse men were both gone. This was someone else entirely. The version of him that ran 43 operations. The underboss, in full. She'd been afraid of this version once. Sitting in a concrete room in the dark, she found she wasn't anymore. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." His hands moved to her forearms anyway, turning them over once, checking. Then her face, thumbs at her jaw, tilting her chin, looking at her eyes the way you check someone for shock. "I'm not in shock," she said. "I'm angry." Something in his expression shifted, relief folding into something that, on a less controlled face, might have looked like it wanted to smile. "Good," he said. He stood and held out his hand. She took it and stood, and he didn't let go as he walked her out. The warehouse had people in it now, 4 of his men, positions distributed with the efficiency of people who had done this before. Yuhak was not present. She'd learn later he'd been located elsewhere, the confrontation already handled through channels she didn't ask about and he didn't detail. On the floor near the entrance, the driver sat with his hands zip-tied and his eyes on his shoes. She looked at him as she passed and felt nothing complicated. Just tired. Outside, the river was close, she'd been right about that. The night air hit her and she pulled in a breath of it and held it for a moment. Jae-il's car was at the curb. He opened the door for her. Inside, with the door closed and the city moving past the windows, he reached across and took her hand without looking at her. Laced his fingers through hers. His jaw was tight and a muscle worked in it steadily, and she understood she was watching a man exercise significant restraint over a significant amount of feeling. She turned her hand over in his and held back. "Tobias," she said. "Already confirmed safe. Mrs. O has him, there at the hotel, she knows nothing happened." He paused. "I had someone on them all evening. After the park, I should have told you. I didn't want to alarm you." She processed that. Someone watching them. Discreetly. Yes. She thought about being annoyed by that. Decided, given the evening's events, that she would save it. "Yuhak," he said. His voice flattened on the name. "He's my second. Was my second." He saw Tobias as a threat to his position. "I didn't," he stopped. "I didn't see it coming fast enough. That's on me." "Is it handled?" "Yes." "Completely?" He looked at her then. "Completely." She nodded. Looked back out the window. They rode in silence for a while, hands still joined, the city lights moving across the glass. She thought about Tobias drawing koi fish at the hotel desk and felt the full force of what the evening could have been and set it down deliberately because that was not what happened. What happened was she'd sent 2 numbers to the right person and he'd come. "You kept the code," he said quietly. She glanced at him. "The 21, he said. 5 years. You kept it." She hadn't thought about it consciously. It had simply been the first thing her hands knew to do. "So did you," she said. "You knew what it meant." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he brought her hand up and pressed his mouth briefly to her knuckles, not romantic, not performed. Just human. Just real. He held her hand the rest of the drive. She didn't sleep. Not from fear, the fear had burned off somewhere on that drive back, replaced by something quieter and more permanent. She lay in the dark listening to Tobias breathe and thought about the shape of her life and how strange it was that it had led her back here, to this city, to him, through an airport gate at 6 a.m. like the universe had simply grown impatient with her taking the long way around. She'd built something real in Lagos. Her job, her flat, her routines, the small dignified life she'd constructed around her son with deliberate care. She wasn't someone who needed rescuing. She hadn't come to Seoul looking for anything. But something had found her anyway. At 4 a.m. she stopped pretending she was going to sleep and made coffee and sat by the window and watched the city hold its breath before dawn. By the time Tobias woke up and immediately began explaining to his turtle why today was going to be a good day, she knew what she wanted to say. She just needed him to be there to hear it. He came at 9. She'd messaged him simply, "Come before we leave. Please." He arrived with no men, no car waiting outside. He'd walked, she realized, from somewhere nearby. He wore a plain gray sweater and looked like someone who hadn't slept either. She opened the door and he stood in the corridor with his hands in his pockets and something open in his face that she didn't think many people ever got to see. Tobias is with Mrs. O, she said. Down the hall. She's doing a goodbye Korean lesson. He nodded. Came inside. They sat, her on the chair, him on the edge of the bed, with the morning light coming through the curtains and the sound of Seoul waking up below them. Not the boardroom. Not the penthouse. Just a hotel room with checkout in 2 hours and all the real things still needing to be said. I've been thinking, she started. So have I, he said. Let me go first. He waited. She looked at her hands. I spent 5 years being afraid of what you were. And I understand now that fear wasn't wrong exactly, it was just incomplete. I only saw one part of you in that corridor and I ran from it without waiting to see the rest. She looked up. I'm not 22 anymore. I don't run from things I don't understand. I ask about them. He was very still. I'm not asking you to be something you're not, she continued. I'm not asking for a timeline or a promise you can't keep yet. I know what your world looks like, you showed me honestly and I respect that. What I'm asking for is, she stopped. Found the right word. A door. You said that to me once. I'm giving it back to you. The door is open. It has been open. I just needed you to know I'm standing on my side of it intentionally. Not by accident. He was quiet for a moment. I've been restructuring for 2 years, he said. Before I knew about Tobias. Before I saw you at that gate. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I want to be honest, that world doesn't disappear in a straight line. There will be months that are complicated. Things I'll have to handle that I'd rather you didn't see. I can't promise you clean. I'm not asking for clean, she said. I'm asking for honest. That I can do. And Tobias. I meant what I said at the park. He held her gaze. He comes first. Whatever we are or aren't, he has a father. That's already decided. Nothing changes that. She nodded slowly. He reached across the space between them and tucked that same lock behind that same ear, their gesture now, worn smooth with repetition, and she caught his hand before it withdrew and held it against her cheek for a moment. Okay, she said. Okay, he said back. Mrs. O brought Tobias back at 10:30. He burst through the door already mid-story about a Korean word he'd learned that meant something rude and Mrs. O absolutely hadn't taught him intentionally, then he registered Jae-il sitting in the room and stopped. He looked at Jae-il. Looked at Solène. Back at Jae-il. You're here, he said, with the tone of someone confirming a hypothesis. I am, Jae-il said. Tobias crossed the room, climbed onto the bed beside him without invitation, and held up the ceramic turtle. This is Jae, he announced. I named him yesterday. Solène went very still. Jae-il looked at the turtle. Looked at her son. When did you name him? Yesterday at the fountain. He looked like a jay. Tobias shrugged with the total confidence of someone who trusted his own instincts completely. Do you want to hold him? Jae-il took the turtle carefully in both hands. Thank you, he said. You can give him back before we go, Tobias said generously. He has to come to Lagos. Solène pressed her fingers to her mouth and looked at the ceiling. The airport was full again. Different gate this time. Different direction. She stood at departures with her carry-on and Tobias on her hip, heavier than 4 days ago somehow, soul-fed and soul-happy, and Jae-il beside her in the particular way of someone who was very aware this was the last few minutes. He'd carried her bag from the cab. Argued briefly with Tobias about whether the turtle needed its own passport. Lost the argument. Now they stood at the point where he couldn't follow. He crouched down in front of Tobias first. Looked at him seriously, at eye level, the way Tobias demanded to be looked at. I'll come to Lagos, he said. In a few weeks. Is that all right? Tobias considered this with appropriate gravity. Can we go to the beach? Yes. Okay. He held out his hand for a formal shake. Deal. Jae-il shook it. Stood. He faced her. She told herself she wasn't going to make this large. It didn't need to be large. It just needed to be true. Don't disappear again, she said. I was going to say the same thing to you, he said. She laughed, small, involuntary, the kind that comes when something is genuinely funny and genuinely painful at the same time. He smiled then, the full one, the Hongdae Jazz Bar one, and it still did exactly what it had always done. He pulled her in with one hand at the back of her neck and kissed her, unhurried, certain, in the middle of Incheon International with trolleys moving around them and announcements layering overhead and Tobias making a sound of elaborate disgust somewhere at hip height. Not a goodbye. A coordinate. This is where we are. Come back to this. When he pulled back she kept her eyes closed for one extra second. Then she picked up her son, who immediately began describing the kiss as very gross actually, and she walked toward the gate with her carry-on rolling behind her and did not look back. She didn't need to. She already knew he was still standing there. Still watching until the gate swallowed her completely. And for the first time in 5 years, Solène Abara walked away from Shin Jae-il not running from something, but toward it. The END. Make to like, subscribe and comment how this story made you feel. Share this with someone who needs a good love story today. They'll thank you later.